Hey there everyone, and I thank you guys so much for tuning in to yet another episode of my orchid adventure with me, Maria Young. I have been really working hard trying to transform the face of my garden. And although I do have a variety of different plants, I am trying to incorporate more of my orchids into its natural landscape, hoping to transform my garden into more of an orchid paradise for sure. So I figured what better way to do that than to have orchids actually growing within the soil of my garden. Which brings us to the topic of this episode, where we're going to be talking all about ground growing orchids. Now, there are so many different varieties of your terrestrial orchids, and I have some available today to show you, and we're going to go ahead and speak a little bit more in detail about what I love most about terrestrial orchids. Now, because there are several varieties of these ground-growing orchids, you do have to understand that there are also a variety of culture guidelines and care that these orchids require. But today we're going to talk about the orchids that are more commonly seen, and also we're going to talk in a more general rule of thumb. Now, what I love most about ground-growing orchids is that if you take care of them properly and give them the right conditions that they need, they have a growth habit where they can multiply quite quickly and provide you just such a beautiful ground cover with beautiful foliage and also beautiful blossoms. And another great characteristic about your ground-growing orchid is that many of them are actually cold tolerant and actually can withstand freezing temperatures. And they are also known to be quite easy to grow, giving you quite a bang for your buck in the fact that they are so inexpensive. And a very important thing to note about these ground-growing orchids is the fact that in nature, although they do grow in soil, they grow in organic material with a lot of aeration and also good drainage. So let's now take a look at some of the different varieties. And this right here, folks, is the Arundina graminifolia, also known as the bamboo orchid. Now, you can definitely see why they call this the bamboo orchid, because it looks just like that. Also, the blooms on here are sequential bloomers and is also known to bloom throughout the season. And the blooms on here are fairly nice size at about 2.5 inches and definitely mimics a beautiful Cattleya bloom. This is an orchid that loves to grow in full sun and has a growth habit of growing in large clumps. And the orchid that we have next on our list is a Tila striata, also known as the Chinese ground-growing orchid. And these are known to bloom in a very nice cluster of Cattleya-looking blossoms. How beautiful. Now, these orchids, although they do like bright light, they don't really too much care for direct sunlight. And if you give them too much sunlight, indeed, they will expose it in their foliage. So keeping this orchid in bright shade or partial shade will do it a lot of good. Now, this orchid right here is known to be the Phayus orchid, also known as the nun's cap orchid or the nun's orchid. And the reason why it's known to be the nun's cap orchid is that when it blooms, its rather large blossoms, they actually look like a nun's cap. This is known to bloom in a huge cluster of blossoms and is known to be fragrant and blooming 4 to 6 weeks. And here's an interesting fact about the spike of the nun's orchid. As you can see, it is rather thick. And if you allow this to bloom and finish blooming, afterwards you can actually cut this in 6-inch segments, and this can be used as a propagation method where you may be lucky enough to have a new growth of a new orchid actually growing from the spike. How interesting is that? Like, totally duh! And here, folks, we have the Glottis plicata, also known as the Philippine orchid. And this orchid is known for its variation of bloom colors and also the multitude of blooms on its inflorescences, blooming about 1.5 inches in each of its blooms. The Glottis orchid is known for its star quality in its formation of its blooms and also is known for producing multiple spikes throughout the entire year. Also, a common trait of this type of ground-growing orchid is its rippled, beautiful, striking foliage that indeed is quite attractive. Also, another form of ground-growing orchid is your epidendrum orchid, also known as the radican and the crucifix orchid. This orchid blooms in quite a cluster of miniature blossoms about 1 inch in diameter and definitely mimics the cattleya. This orchid is indeed free-flowering and is known to bloom throughout the entire year. Indeed, folks, these are some fabulous orchids to have because not only are they attractive and really add such a color and a splash to your orchid collection, but they are also easy to care for, easy to grow, very charming orchids, and also you will get quite a bang for your buck in the fact that majority of these terrestrial orchids are free flowering and indeed are quite inexpensive. So these are the reasons why I have selected to have these orchids growing in my orchid garden and growing naturally. And that brings us to the conclusion of our episode talking all about the ground-growing orchids. I thank you guys so much for tuning in to yet another episode of My Orchid Adventures with me, Maria Young. And of course, if you liked this video, please be sure to give it a green thumbs up. And if you want to stay tuned for these type of videos, please be sure to subscribe. Also, if you want to follow me on my Facebook adventures, you can do that as well at My Orchid Adventures. And if you want to contact me via snail mail, you can do that as well at the following address right here. Again, I thank you guys so much for tuning in, and as you already know, I love you all. Mwah!